Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marie Taillard. I'm the Executive Director of the Executive Master in the Future of Energy, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon, this morning, this evening, as the case may be, wherever you happen to be. Just a couple words, very, very brief words about the program. It is an exciting program. It's a program that focuses on, of course, the future of energy, talking about sustainables, talking about the transition from traditional energy to the future of energy to sustainables. A lot of different aspects, starting from finance to operational supply chain issues, the economics, of course, of sustainable energy, the legal aspects, and so on and so forth. A very, very generalist approach, which really gives pretty much everyone a chance to figure out what it is that is of interest to them in that particular sector and find their own way. Many of the participants we have this year are people who are looking to transition themselves into a new career in sustainable energy and who are eager to really discover the full scope of what's out there, where the opportunities are, where the challenges are, and so on and so forth. If you would like to find out more about the program, I would like to encourage you to contact the wonderful Ida Ofori, who is with us this afternoon and who can answer some of your questions during the Q&A and tell you more about the program. We are very actively recruiting participants right now for the 2023 intake. As a reminder, the program is a blended program. That means that it is available in two options. One is the full program includes mostly online, but also some live seminars during the course of the year. The online only option is also available, obviously, at a slightly lower tuition fee. That's pretty much all I want to tell you about the program. Again, Ida is the expert there, and I will let her tell you about it more during the Q&A. What I want to do now is to introduce my colleague, Anthony Evans. Anthony is a professor of economics at ESCP Business School, of course, colleague of mine. We actually started around the same time. He's a professor of economics, as I said, and has been doing quite a bit of work recently on scenario planning and thinking about how companies, organizations in general, go about thinking about the future. And of course, that is a very relevant approach to thinking about the role of sustainables in our future economy. There is no better time, given the current context, to be thinking in this way. And I think Anthony is going to help us understand how to use that in fact, that methodology. It is a way to think about the future and to be able to think about it systematically. So I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Anthony is highly published and successful scholar who has a lot to say about many topics, and this is one that I personally am very, very eager to hear him talk about. Over to you, Anthony, and thank you for accepting our invitation this afternoon.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Marie. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. It's great to see so many people here. What I am going to try and do in this talk is give you an overview of the scenario method and how it's important not only for any business in any industry, but in particular as a means by which we can understand the future context of the energy industry. Now we're scheduled, I think, for an hour tonight. I'm hoping that we'll have lots of time for questions and answers, so I can become as controversial and as radical as necessary. My aim is to kind of maybe spend 30-40 minutes or so going through some notes that I've prepared and then opening things up, and hopefully we can have a nice conversation and see where this leads us. So to start off with, as Marie mentioned, I'm an economist, and I think of myself as a fairly unusual economist, in the sense that one of the big questions that economists who are interested in energy at the moment are being asked is, what do we think is going to happen to energy prices in particular? Economists are obviously specialists looking at market data, understanding demand and supply conditions. And this common question that we get in any marketplace is what's happening with prices, and energy prices at the moment are such an important topical event that we get this a lot. Now, the reason why I say that I'm an unusual economist is that I'm incredibly comfortable with saying I don't know what will happen to energy prices when asked that question. And that's in contrast, I think, to most economists who feel obliged to give some kind of a prediction or forecast or some kind of judgment as to what they think might happen. I don't really understand why so many people listen to economists. It's a very odd situation where we're used to being asked these questions that we can't answer, and then we want to kind of provide an answer out of embarrassment, perhaps, or out of some kind of false awareness of how much knowledge that we have. I think the main reasons that people listen so much to economists making forecasts and predictions is because maybe there's some kind of confusion about what economics is as a subject. I think that some people think that if you understand something, that you need to be able to kind of make predictions about what's going to happen. If you can't predict into the future, it means you don't understand what's happened in the past. I would reject that. I think we can, try to form explanations about events that have happened in the past without expecting that explanation to be able to carry on into the future. So there's some methodological confusion about the role of economics. But also, I think the main reason that people ask economists these types of prediction and forecast is just because it's a very cheap form of content. So if people are writing newspaper articles, if journalists want to kind of fill pages, they know that, if they ask an economist to make a prediction or a forecast, then that gives them some free content, and economists like to get free content. And most economists probably spend so much time making predictions and forecasts that even if 95% of them are completely incorrect, then they hope that the 5% that turn out to be reasonably accurate will actually kind of give them their reputation. I was actually looking recently, I'm just going to have a quick look on my screen now because I've got some data. When I teach a standard economics course, I like to explain to my students just how bad economists are at making forecasts. You probably remember the global financial crisis. If we look back at asking ourselves, who predicted that and who foresaw that? If we look at what was happening in the summer of 2008, there's a wonderful publication that the UK Treasury reports, which is an overview of a wide range of different UK-based economic forecasters. In June 2008, the growth predictions for 2009 across pretty much all of those professional forecasters were between 0.5 and 3% growth. In the summer of 2008, pretty much all professional forecasters in the UK thought that the following year would see growth between 0.5 and 3%. The actual value was minus 5.4%, and these figures gets revised from time to time, so it doesn't matter too much about the precise figure. But it's really quite remarkable that the range was 0.5 to 3, and the actual outcome was minus 5.4. The one team who did a reasonably good job that actually forecast minus 2% growth, so the only economic forecaster that actually thought there would be a recession in 2009 and correctly foresaw that in the summer of 2008, was an economic forecaster. The company's called Economic Perspectives. I know the person behind that, and I always thought to myself, wow, given how prescient he was in 2008, 2009, presumably he's become an incredibly affluent, in-demand economist. I then wanted to understand what was happening following COVID. Recently, I saw the Sunday Times publish an overview of how economic forecasters fared in 2021. They gave each economic forecaster a grade out of 10, a score out of 10 based on their forecasts that they'd made for 2021. And the top score was 5 out of 10. And sure enough, economic perspectives were top of the list. So when I normally say kind of economists are really bad at making forecasts and we shouldn't listen to economists, another thing that I find quite puzzling is when we do actually see examples of economic forecasts that are incredibly accurate compared to everybody else. Nobody seems to kind of listen and pay too closer attention to those ones. So I think there's a really big industry-wide problem here where we have this myth that economists know what's going to happen, and then we kind of pretend to listen to them as well. One big reason why economists get kind of lulled into this trap of attempting to give overly omniscient predictions about what will happen is because economists are fundamentally uneasy with the concept of uncertainty. I come from a fairly different background in economics, where uncertainty is not necessarily something that is comforting or comfortable, but uncertainty is something that is accepted. So whereas most economists try to deny the concept of uncertainty and try to make assumptions that allow them to make forecasts and to enable the planning, what I would do is to say that uncertainty or conditions of uncertainty aren't good. I don't like uncertainty, but I accept that that's the decision-making context that we all face. In that case, we need to come up with methods that accept that uncertainty is the norm, rather than decision-making methods that assume uncertainty away and give us this false sense of certainty where it doesn't exist. A common question I see at the moment is who predicted the current volatility and disruption that we see in energy markets, and looking back to see who kind of saw that coming. And fundamentally, I would say that's the wrong question to ask. We should not be looking into the past to try to work out who predicted what's been going on at the moment. What's been going on at the moment is a function of some long-standing issues. So things never come out of the blue. The long-standing issues, I think, at the moment are threefold. One is reduced reliance on fossil fuels. So obviously that's been a trend for some time. To some extent, higher energy bills are the stated objective of parts of the environmental movement. Lots of government policy has been deliberately designed to make energy bills more expensive, to try to transition away from traditional sources of fuels. And so spiking energy bills is a stated objective of what they're trying to achieve. Another long-standing issue is Russian adventurism. So this hasn't come completely out of the blue. And people that are familiar with geopolitical trends will have this on their horizon already. And then another long-standing issue, I think, is unusual weather patterns. So I think the reasons for kind of seeing prices spike when they did was those three factors all combining: the reduced reliance on fossil fuels, plus Russian adventurism, plus unusual weather conditions. We have this kind of perfect storm. The problem really is how they've been combined to create an extremely novel situation. And it's, I think, certainly the case that we are in a situation now that is extremely novel, but it hasn't come from nowhere. It's a function of existing trends and existing issues coinciding. So if the wrong question is, who predicted this and who saw this coming, and maybe we should find that person and go and talk to them about what's going to happen in the future, a better question is to say, what is the set of alternative future contexts in which our decisions play out? Instead of making a prediction about what we think is going to happen, the question is, what is the set of alternative future contexts our decisions will play out? The scenario method is designed to be able to give some help to our answering of that question. It's a very structured process that allows us to create a set of alternative future contexts and gives us a platform for us to understand and make sense of what's happening around us. We're not saying, what do you think is going to happen? We are saying, what might happen? And those are two fundamentally different questions. For example, some questions may have been, and one question was Putin going to invade Ukraine? And some people would say, yes, I think he will. Some people might have said, no, I think he won't. Now, maybe there's a question about, will he back down? And some people might be thinking he will. Some people will think he won't. Will he use nuclear weapons? Some people might say yes. Some people might say no. Some people might try to kind of manage this difficulty of knowing what will happen by assigning some kind of probability value. So we may not know one way or the other, but we assign a probability value to try to get some sense of what's going to happen. The scenario method fundamentally says we don't need to try to assign these probability values to events. What we need to do instead is just to consider different things that might occur. In other words, the question might be, what would we do, or what would it look like if this happens? What would it look like if something else happens? What are the options available, and what does the world look like if those options occur? It's very important to recognize that when we talk about scenarios, we're not trying to predict the future. And whereas there's a nice interlink between futurologists and scenario planners, and whilst all of us, I think, kind of get quite excited about thinking about what the future might look like and maybe trying to make some kind of prediction, there's a very big difference. There's a big difference between having a vague or maybe even a creative view of how things are going to change. And some people will do that. They'll try to kind of sell or promote that particular vision. They'll use their creative thinking to have a view of the future that they want other people to kind of latch onto and to recognize as well. And we can contrast this with the scenario method, which is more of an imaginative vision about plausible futures, which we then relate back to our current situation. So thinking about a range of different futures, not trying to think about what's the most likely, not trying to think about what's going to happen, but having a range of different views of the future that allow us to understand what's happening today. In scenario planning, what we do is we use the future to inform the present. So it's almost as though we have a completely different conception of time. I think our intuition is often about saying we understand the present, and from the perspective of the present, we look forwards into the future. What scenario planning encourages to do is to say that we have a vision of the future, and then we bring that back to where we are today. When we think about Russia's invasion in particular, I would argue that whilst many people were shocked and some people were surprised by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's a very big difference between those two concepts. I would say that I was surprised by the invasion, but I wasn't shocked. And that's a big difference. Some people were shocked, they didn't see it coming. I will never claim to say that I did see it coming or that I thought it would happen. But I had considered it at some point, and therefore, even though I was surprised that that was what was happening, it wasn't a shocking event. In 2020, I wrote a set of geopolitical scenarios, and that was as a consequence of the presidential election in Belarus. One of those scenarios was based on a loss of sovereignty that Belarus had, and Putin being a de facto leader of an enlarged territory, and therefore having significant more power to be able to exert his influence in that region. Now, when I wrote those scenarios, it was very much focused on the kind of the domestic situation in Belarus, and it was just a consequence by thinking about what that would have on the wider region. But I do think it's interesting to note that there is no way that Russia would have been able to have done the actions that they've done in Kiev, were it not for the fact that Russian troops were on Belarusian soil. And the only reason that they were on Belarusian soil was because the West had essentially allowed Putin to take over what was some argued a client state, but essentially became a no longer an independent state in 2020. I think that's something that is remaining a challenge, a blot on the role of the West in this area. Now, the scenario method became famous due, I think, to military war games. So it kind of originates in the 1960s, 1970s. At the time, at the height of the Cold War, people are concerned about nuclear weapons. And so scenario planning kind of coincides with that, that period of time. It's also very synonymous with the energy sector, because the company that it kind of has demonstrated, I think, most fully the usefulness and the benefits of scenario planning is, of course, Shell. To some extent, the kind of surprised manner in which the formation of OPEC kind of disrupted and challenged the energy industry was a key reason for why scenarios became widely adopted. Shell credit the use of scenarios to having anticipated a return to cheaper oil and also the impact of perestroika and the cooling of the Cold War. This is one of the reasons where we can get into some difficulties when thinking about what scenarios can and cannot achieve. It's been claimed that Shell anticipated perestroika as a consequence of their scenarios, and then the obvious next point is to say, well, where's the clarity with which we can see them having predicted that? Did those scenarios allow them to feel that the Berlin Wall would come down in 1989? Where's the scenario where they point out that in 1991 the Soviet Union would dissolve? Where do they point out that Yeltsin would come to power? Where do they point out the massive transference of Russian national wealth to oligarchs and then the resulting things? Of course, a scenario is not intended to create a roadmap of plausible things that we expect to happen in sequence. But what those scenarios did enable Shell to do was to consider a wide range of different futures, such that when the perestroika reform started to be made, and when you started to see some of the tensions within that, then it gave their senior executive team some almost like a memory of a future that they have already experienced. I would argue that Shell remain the best example of a best-in-class scenario construction, but lots of other companies across lots of other industries also use scenarios, and there was a massive uptick in demand for scenarios following 9/11. I was looking back at some of the data on this. I was doing some Google Ngram studies of when people have been using the term scenario planning, scenario method and things like that. And it's very visible that the scenario method became very popular in the 1970s. It then has another massive boost in the early 2000s. 9/11 made people, I think, much more aware of the conditions of uncertainty, and it gave many businesses a necessity to come up with tools that allowed them to cope with conditions of uncertainty. I believe that COVID will have a similar impact. So it looks to me as though there's another wave of interest in scenario planning now. And I think that businesses do recognize that we live in particularly turbulent times. We live in conditions of uncertainty. There's a lot of novelty about, there's a lot of ambiguity that people need to deal with. And in the same way that we saw the surge of scenarios in the 1970s, also in the early 2000s, I'm expecting that there to be another one now. For that reason, I developed a 2-day course in scenario planning. This is something that we use within ESCP as part of our Master in Management program. It's also used for internal training for companies within the industry. One of the reasons why I like teaching that on the Master in Energy Management in particular is that I get to explore a favorite topic of mine. So whereas scenarios are giving a very broad and comprehensive look at alternative futures, a particular topic that I am interested in is nuclear power, which I want to talk a little bit now because I think that is a very important element of future contexts in the sector. I mentioned before that part of my academic research is in Belarus. And of course, Belarus has a very close link with nuclear power for two main reasons. Belarus was one of the main victims of the Chernobyl disaster. So even though Chernobyl is obviously in Ukraine, it's very close to the Belarusian border, and the way that the weather conditions of the time meant that most of the fallout went into the Belarusian territory. The other main reason why Belarus is such an interesting country to consider when we think about nuclear power is that they unilaterally disarmed their nuclear assets. And so in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Belarus had nuclear assets stationed on its territory, and it unilaterally was willing to disarm those and to give those up and to not be a nuclear power. With the help of two former students on the Master in Energy Management program, I wrote a report for the Croatian Ministry of Finance not too long ago. What we did was we applied a problem-solving approach to try to assess alternative ways to meet future energy needs for Croatia in particular. We looked at a range of different options, and the main outcome of that report was the prospect of small modular nuclear reactors, or SMRs. It does seem to be that the technology is in place now where we could have massive amounts of relatively clean energy coming from nuclear. And what I find remarkable about the kind of public policy angle to this is that, you know, the most kind of the clearest constraint and barrier to being able to exploit almost limitless amounts of clean power is widespread public hostility, which is based on things like the Chernobyl disaster and those visual images that people have, and the kind of scaremongering that's taken place. I don't know how many of the people attending now are doing so because they saw my advert for this event on LinkedIn. But I think in the LinkedIn advert, I said that I would reveal the stupidest policy decision of the last 20 years. Just in case there's any doubt about what that is, it's Germany's decision to move away from nuclear power, and in doing so, enable and embolden Putin even more than he otherwise would have been. Now, when it comes to scenario construction, when building scenarios, there's really kind of two main elements to that process. It's a fairly long and time-consuming process to do it properly. But what I found is that even in a relatively short period of time, such as a 2-day module, it's possible to kind of get the main outcomes. The two main elements of a scenario construction is to firstly identify some key trends and to have a very clear understanding about what those key trends are. And then secondly, to consider some critical uncertainties. So those key trends are things that are relevant to the industry that we're interested in. They are things that are probably going to be relevant no matter what happens because they're already almost baked into the system. We do need to be careful about thinking that, too many things are predetermined. I always used to talk about things like vaccine pipelines as being an example of a slow changing phenomena. So if we're building scenarios about kind of 10, 15-year horizons, then we have a good understanding about what the state of various vaccines, various medical conditions are going to be in that time period. Because if those things aren't already kind of in process now, if they're not in phase 1 clinical trial, if they're not at the patent stage, then we're going to have that 10, 15-year horizon before we start to see them. That obviously changed somewhat with the success of Operation Warp Speed with the COVID vaccine, and we see that the vaccine pipeline can kind of shrink from 10 to 15 years to maybe 1 year. So we need to be careful that these kind of key trends aren't just being treated and made an assumption that they're going to hold across all different possible scenarios. But the contrast to this is the critical uncertainties, and this is what gives the richness and the quality and depth to a scenario where we really identify what are the key uncertainties in this industry, and then what does the future look like under those different possible outcomes. And we use those divergent uncertainties to actually build those scenarios. So we can think about what some of the key trends are. I think the key trends that come to mind, and I've kind of workshopped this recently with some of our students. A key trend is a populist fueled authoritarianism. That's something that's been happening for some time. We're seeing a major kind of movement away from democracy, having had a big increase in global democracy over a fairly sustained period of time. We're kind of now back to 2007 levels when we look at what proportion of the global population are living in a free regime or a not free regime. That rise in authoritarianism is clearly associated with populist tendencies, and we see that as a global phenomena. So that's one important key trend. I think another key trend is aging populations for kind of growth driving countries. So various countries around the world, we see aging populations, and demographic changes tend to be an obvious starting point when we're thinking about what these key trends and slow changing phenomena are. To some extent, migration policy can become a critical uncertainty because depending on how policymakers affect their migration patterns, they can undermine some of the demographic changes that are taking place. It's actually quite difficult, though, to kind of make dramatic changes to what that core demographic impact will be. Another key trend is clearly reductions in carbon emissions and increased energy intensivity. We see kind of a flatlining of carbon emissions per capita in certain countries. We see a kind of dramatic decoupling of energy intensiveness in certain countries. And so there's clearly a movement in that direction. Another key trend, I think, is increased security concerns. So when we were thinking about kind of national infrastructure plans maybe 10, 20 years ago, I think there was much less attention to national security concerns. But now this is something that is much more prevalent and has the tendency to continue. Another key trend is improvements in battery and natural gas storage. And so when we're looking into the future, it seems likely that every kind of plausible vision of the future that we have will to some extent be based on much more superior battery storage capacity than we've had in the past. So looking forwards, we have a world where we have this populist fueled authoritarianism, we have aging populations, we have reductions in carbon emissions in some parts of the world, we have greater security concerns, we have improvements in battery and natural gas storage. Some of these are political issues, some of these economic, some social, some technological, some environmental, some legal. We can kind of tick all of those boxes, we can cover all of our bases and find a bunch of key trends. And then the really interesting thing is where we start to understand what the critical uncertainties are that will mean that different visions of the future are distinct from each other. What are the junctures at which those different futures might emerge? One critical uncertainty is the kind of technological progress being made in nuclear fusion. So one key question I think that we have is, will there be a breakthrough in nuclear fusion? We're seeing a massive increase in the amount of attention being given to it. If we just look at even simple metrics like number of companies where their primary focus is nuclear fusion, we have exponential growth in the United Kingdom alone. There's a general sense of optimism within that industry that we may be on the verge of a major breakthrough. If that's the case, then we may have energy that's too cheap to meter. But that's a fundamentally scientific and fundamentally technological uncertainty. I think a key economic uncertainty is whether or not growth is effectively over. So it's very common to talk about the fourth industrial revolution. And when I teach in my economics classes, I question that concept. When I look at economic history and I look at the data, what I can see is that there was a very long period of human history where there is basically zero growth. So that's basically from the beginning of recorded human history up until the kind of, let's say, 16th, 15th century, possibly going into the 16th century, maybe kind of 1750 as being a period of where we start to see something interesting happen. Prior to that period of 1700 to 1750, there is basically no growth. We obviously have instances where some civilizations advance, but what we don't see is evidence of sustained economic growth in the sense that people routinely expect future generations to be successively richer than they were. That's an incredibly recent phenomenon. It only starts to happen in the period that we kind of know as the Industrial Revolution. There's obviously big debates about how we date the Industrial Revolution. Some would argue that it kind of begins in that 1750 period. But whenever we kind of date it, that seems to me to be the single event that's happened in human history that managed to unlock the capacity for sustained economic growth. We have a period of relative poverty and misery up until that point. And then something happens that we now kind of refer to as the Industrial Revolution, which meant that some countries around the world unlocked this secret recipe of economic growth and made massive increases in living standards and increases in economic growth year after year after year. Now, when looking at that data, It seems that that's been tailing off. Globally, something very important was happening in the 1970s. We can see total factor productivity in the United States clearly kind of go on a different trend line in the mid-1970s. In the UK, it was probably a bit earlier than that. It was probably around 1900 that we start to see the UK kind of slip down onto a lower trend path. Following the global financial crisis, that's been even more severe, where we've essentially had kind of pretty much no growth since the global financial crisis. But this is a much long-standing phenomena where we see growth subsiding. If it's the case that we basically had no growth until the Industrial Revolution, then we had maybe 100 years or so of economic growth of between 2 to 3% for some countries. So a relatively small number of countries managed to enjoy 2 to 3% economic growth for maybe about 100 years or so. Now it seems to be back down to 1%. And so I think this is a big open question about whether or not we will settle onto that new growth trajectory, whether or not we will come up with technological breakthroughs or innovation that will allow us to move back to a higher growth path, and whether or not we even want to be on a higher growth path, because of course a big part of the environmental movement now is trying to tell us that growth is a bad thing, and that economic wealth creation shouldn't be a major policy or major focal point that we should have. So regardless of, maybe that growth is over because we have stopped inventing things, maybe growth's over because we've chosen that we don't want it anymore. I'd say another critical uncertainty is whether or not a nuclear accident or the use of nuclear weapons would destroy public confidence in the nuclear industry. I think this is probably one of the most important issues facing humanity right now. I think it's incredibly unlikely that there would be a nuclear accident at a nuclear power station. It's almost impossible for something like Chernobyl to happen again, for example, the Chernobyl explosion. What's much more likely, though, is that given the situation in Europe, in parts of Eastern Europe at the moment, is that a nuclear weapon may be deployed. And if a nuclear weapon is deployed, I think that would set back public confidence in the nuclear industry, understandably, even if they're kind of fundamentally different levels of safety involved. And if that was the case, then we would imagine a much slower growth path in terms of our energy capacity and capabilities. So based on some of those critical uncertainties, is there going to be a breakthrough in nuclear fusion? Is growth over? Is there going to be a major collapse in public confidence of the nuclear industry? Those are, I think, the key relevant uncertainties that we can start to think about what plausible futures may emerge from there. Let me just justify a little bit why I've spoken so much about nuclear power here. I think it's common for people to refer to 3 existential threats that humanity currently faces. Those 3 existential threats are climate change, and general artificial intelligence, and nuclear war or nuclear catastrophe. Of those 3 existential threats, climate change is something that is obviously very highly focused on and is at the forefront of most of our agendas. Whether or not we're making progress on that, it's not for the lack of awareness, I would argue. There's a lot of interest and focus on artificial intelligence. This is a massive kind of growth industry, and most business ethics courses that touch upon these things will focus on them. That's something that I do. So I teach a course on the political, economic, and social consequences of digital transformation. We spend, a big chunk of that course talking about how we should be regulating artificial intelligence, whether we cannot regulate it, the manners in which we can do so. It seems to me that the nuclear question is much more neglected, and there's fewer people talking about that. So one of the reasons why I try to put some research focus on this and talk a lot about nuclear power, not necessarily because it's the most important thing, but because it's an important thing and it's relatively neglected. I think the solutions to these existential threats, possibly all of these existential threats have similar solutions, and they're twofold. One of them is a massive increase in wealth, and the other is collective action through international institutions. And so I think that's how we will resolve them. And one of the reasons why I am so happy to be teaching in a business school such as ESCP is because business schools, I think, are largely responsible for both of those factors. What we do when we do management education training is we try to create entrepreneurs that find ways in which they create value in the world and create goods and services that people value, and in doing so, obviously increase wealth and become richer as a consequence. Also, one of the things that we spend a lot of time and effort thinking about is how we can turn zero-sum games into win-win, how we can negotiate, how we can understand other contexts, how we can deal with people with different needs and different backgrounds, and how we can take a universal approach to these types of issues. So rather than thinking about this as a zero-sum problem, it's trying to find ways in which we can collectively come together through international institutions, how we can improve those international institutions so that we can solve these major problems facing humanity. It's obviously very popular now, and I referred before to the rise of populism and authoritarianism. It's very popular to denigrate international institutions, to say that they are dysfunctional, to say that they are not perfect. Of course, both of those things are true. It's incredibly difficult to kind of achieve those objectives, but the only way that we can achieve those objectives is by working harder and spending more time and effort thinking about ways in which we can improve them. So just to bring this to a close, I think if we need to move away from short-termism and parochialism, and I think that's one of the key ways in which we solve these global problems, is to move away from short-termism and parochialism, then scenarios are an incredibly effective method to be able to do so. They encourage long-term thinking, not in the sense that you're extending your time horizon and trying to kind of understand what the world will look like in the future, but it's moving you away from a present mindset and focusing too much on the here and now. It's trying to understand what different future contexts mean for what we should do in the present. And so it's very disruptive change in what our time horizon is. And then in terms of parochialism as well, scenarios are a wonderfully creative exercise, which is reliant on different people being able to come together with radically different perspectives. And rather than kind of agree on a consensus, and rather than kind of find a way in which all of those things fit together, it's a way in which we can fully explore that. And it's a way in which those different perspectives can be meted out without having to choose a single narrative that we think is most suitable. It's a way in which we can allow multiple narratives to emerge, and we can find ways in which those multiple narratives help us with our issues in the present. What I've tried to do in that talk is just give you an overview about how a scenario approach looks, with some of the specific insights in the energy industry as I see it. But obviously a proper scenarios process is a long, much more time-consuming affair, but I hope I've perked some interest and curiosity in that. I'd be very keen to kind of go into more detail based on questions that people might have. So I suggest now we open things up, and if you have some questions, I'd love to hear what they are.
So you have a couple of questions already in the Q&A, Anthony. One thing I just want to mention that came to my mind while you were talking, and I was really quite interested, obviously, in your talk. Thank you very much. Is the fact that one of the things I think we do very well at ESCP is get people to think both creatively and analytically simultaneously, really to use data, use analytical thinking, and then inject into it a real creative approach. And so I think, that fits in really well with what you were just talking about. And it's something that I think people, who join our programs across the board can really get a chance to to experience and to practice. So I think that's something to point out. We do have a question for Mariam. Actually, maybe what we should do is Mariam, why don't I give you the floor and let you actually ask your question live. I just opened up your mic, Mariam, if you'd like to join and ask your question live.
Thank you very much. Do you have my voice?
Yes, we hear you.
Thank you very much for your great speech. I very used from them. Actually, my question was that when you said for building a scenario, we should have a vision from future and then going back to present. I didn't get what exactly that means. I mean, well, we have to look at data from present and then we make a actually vision from the future. And but you said the opposite. I didn't get it very well. So it was my my first question. And the second, I wanted to ask you something. If you have a PowerPoint from your speech, can we please have it?
Sure thing. So I've got some notes and I don't know, I've not presented with a PowerPoint, so I don't have a PowerPoint presentation that I can share with you. But what I was planning on doing is I think the recording of this is going to be made available, and I was going to write a couple of bullet points that were just going to summarize the notes that I have, so that will be available and you'll be able to access those. That's a really good question. So what you're doing is you're kind of you're stumbling on the fact that I've tried to give you an overview of some of the relevance of scenarios without really going through the detail about how scenarios get constructed. So it's interesting that you kind of, you know, you want that deeper answer. And so the way is as follows. I mentioned that we define the key trends and we also have these critical uncertainties. So the scenario construction process is that when we have a kind of a clear understanding of what the key trends are, we then consider these critical uncertainties, and then we use the kind of the difference between the extreme outcomes in each uncertainty as a kind of vision of the future. Now, one thing that we need to do before that, which I didn't mention, is that we need to know who our client is, so who it is that we are creating these scenarios for. And that will ideally be kind of an organization that has a very kind of, you know, clear desire to be able to kind of navigate present conditions of uncertainty. I think it is possible to create some generic scenarios that are useful for everybody without having a single designated client. But ideally, you would have a user in mind. So when I'm teaching these on Tuesday, we did a 6-hour seminar with the Master in Energy Management students, and our you know, we didn't have a user, we didn't have a client that we were going to be giving the scenarios to. But we said, let's just imagine that we are dealing now with the person in charge of energy policy for the EU. So we kind of found his name on LinkedIn. We had him on the whiteboard and we said, this is our user. And then we also need to understand the time horizon. So you think about what is the appropriate time horizon for your scenarios. In our case, maybe it's a kind of a 20-25 year horizon is what we want to look for. There's, you know, you could go into more depth about how you would choose that particular time horizon. But then once you've got your user, once you've got your time horizon, you've obviously got your industry that you're focused on. So everybody's attention is given. If it's a 25-year time horizon, you're thinking about what will this industry look like in 25 years. And then based on how those uncertainties will unfold, you then create that picture of what the world will look like. And then when you say going back to the present, once you've constructed your scenarios, you then ask yourself, what is the implication of this scenario for us today? So for example, if you have a scenario where you have rising global populism, you have major kind of political disintegration, rather than having big groups of international communities, you now have lots of individual nations that are all trying to do things separately. You also have some technological disruption. Maybe we have a major breakthrough in fusion technology. We have energy that's too cheap to meter. You put those things together, you create your narrative, and then you say, in that world, in 25 years time, what are the implications for today? What do we need to be doing now that we're not currently doing? Who do we need to be talking to that we're not currently talking to? And what are the kind of questions that we need to answer based on that? So again, that's a very brief way to answer your question. and I hope that's kind of sufficient. But in a full course, we'd go through those step by step in a much more kind of concerted way. But that was the missing thing from my talk, is that you need a user. You need to define what time horizon you're thinking about, and then once you've built those scenarios, you need to relate it back to what we need to do today.
Thank you very much.
Othman just asked a question in the Q&A chat, and Othman, I've given you access to the mic. Do you want to
thank you.
question live? You're welcome. Go for it.
Yeah, well, hello, Anthony. Nice to hear from you again.
You too.
I want to ask a question regarding peak oil, because some say that peak oil for regular oil was achieved like around the 2000s. For hydraulic fraction oil, we are bound to reach it, or we have reached it some years ago or in the few years coming. So what's your take on peak oil, and what do you think it will, what will be the consequences like for the economy? Because everything is based on oil now. So if we reach peak oil and the prices evolve erratically, it will be very complicated for the future, don't you think?
True. Yeah, I'm a little bit concerned that you're kind of pushing me into the direction of wanting me to make a some kind of a forecast or judgment about what's going to happen to prices, which as I said it right at the very beginning, I'm very reluctant to be able to do. I don't know if we've reached peak oil. I'm not massively keen on the precision of the definition of that, because a lot of these things are defining resources in a non-economic way. So I think there's a kind of fundamental myth about thinking of resources in terms of their their physical properties, whereas as an economist, resources are a function of our needs and our of what we deploy them to do. And there's a much more kind of a much more subjective view of what constitutes a resource in the first place, whether something's a resource or not a resource, and whether or not that resource is being depleted at a rate kind of beyond which we can cope with. But the honest answer is, I don't know. I think there would be a lot of relevant information coming from prices were that to be happening. But I'd be very reluctant to kind of make, to give you my impression about what's happening with that.
Okay, well, thank you, Anthony.
I just want to mention, because I see that we have several of our current EMFA participants on in the webinar, that we will be adding a seminar, a 2-day seminar by Anthony in the next few months. We haven't quite decided where to slot it in. But it seems to me that there's real value in doing that. So it's something for you guys to look forward to. And then for those of you who will be joining us as part of the new cohort, we will of course make that available too. I see a hand up from Michael. Michael, I'm going to give you the floor. Give me just 1 second. Here we go. Michael, it's all yours.
Can you hear me all right?
We can indeed.
I'd really just like to compliment Anthony on his talk. I happen to have been involved with scenarios for about 50 years, more than 5 years as Shell's chief economist in Pierre Vac's scenario group in the 70s, and then head of planning at Shell UK in the 1980s. And clearly, for me, your view about economists and their role in not getting involved in forecasting and pretending to forecast the future is thoroughly at one with my views. And I recall the Arab proverb, those who foretell the future lie even when they tell the truth. It's important also to, obviously, for those involved with scenarios to focus on important issues, influential decisions, and it is not, I think, sufficiently brought out, partly for obvious commercial reasons, that scenario work in the past has in fact been very useful to some major companies, including Shell, over the years, and so it shouldn't be denigrated. And at the same time, keeping an open mind is a good alternative to many of the vested interests which come up with biased and dubious claims. And this, unfortunately, is very much evident in net zero claims on timing and on the sorts of issues that I think most of us would be concerned. Basic things like capacity of wind energy performance, solar performance, and so on, which bring back to reality things which maybe we're not very happy to foresee. But you've mentioned, for instance, heavy reliance on natural gas is not going to go away very quickly, and fears about nuclear, whether military or civil, again, these are going to be with us. So well done to you. Thank you very much indeed.
It's great. It's great to hear somebody with that Shell experience. As somebody teaching in a business school, one of the kind of most exciting things is when you see concepts that are used, in companies and are deemed to be a useful part of that over a sustained period of time. So earlier this year, I did the Oxford Scenarios course in Oxford. I first learned about scenarios as a PhD student. So I became interested in methodologically as a means of kind of decision making. So I kind of started with all of the theory and the science behind it, and then kind of aware that it's a useful tool for some businesses. To then be in Oxford earlier this year, where I'm with people from the Shell team, and you're still doing it, you're still using this process. It's part of your kind of an element of competitive advantage, and to see that in the flesh was an incredible experience for me. And I have here with me the most recent Shell scenarios, and the fact that Shell do publish those and make those available and are happy to kind of be seen as being a prime mover of that is good. When I was doing the workshop earlier this week, and I said that most companies probably don't publish their scenarios. It's a choice that you make as a company whether or not you publish them once you've done them. And the students were seemed to be really puzzled. And why would you do all of this work and build these scenarios and then not make a big deal about them publicly? And I said, well, sometimes if you feel like this is a source of commercial advantage, if it's it's an input to decision making, then it's a means to an end, and it's not about the scenarios, it's about how that plugs into strategy, and it's the strategy that you might want to publicly reveal. But it did kind of demonstrate to those students that it might not always be that there's as much visibility here, but there's a lot more people interested in these. But I take my hat off to the fact that Shell are kind of wanting to retain that link and take pride in that, because in a business school we want companies that don't just say every kind of 10 years, oh now we've jumped on to the next fad, or we've moved on from that, and we're trying to do everything and reinvent the wheel again. If something works and it has longevity, then I feel we should celebrate that.
Yes, I had not long ago had to counter claims in a couple of journals about scenario work being a black box. You may recall it.
Yeah, no, so what we've not covered here, which I do a little bit in the course, is some common criticisms of scenario planning, of which there are some, and then I think there's valid responses to those, and yes, lots of things look like black boxes if your alternative is something that's very transparent and very kind of simple, but possibly too simple, and you might have complete transparency over the inputs and the outputs, but the question is whether that's helpful and useful, and whether it achieves the objectives that you have.
I want to take this opportunity to thank Anthony very, very much for having joined us. When I initially approached him to come and do this talk this afternoon, he told me his week was too busy, and I insisted a little more, and I'm very, very grateful to him. I know he's done a lot of teaching this week and this year, and so very grateful to him. Thank you so much, Anthony. I personally was absolutely fascinated. Want to say hi and thanks for joining to our current EMFA participants. I see Stephen, I see Ainur, people that are great participants. Thanks for joining. And to all of you who are not yet our participants, I hope you will be at some point. Hi to Violetta, our colleague. Thank you for joining us, Violetta. Thank you again very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day or your evening, wherever you might be. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.